Armenians and friends, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Dr. Gene Sokolowski, POSSE EDU president, and our topic tonight is Stalin's communization of Poland and the cursed soldiers' resistance. By way of quick background, we at POSSE EDU are a 501c3 nonprofit educational organization, and our mission is to educate Americans and the general public accurately on key aspects of Polish and Polish-American history, culture, and relevant current events. So our guest this evening is Mr. Jan Peczkis. Many of you know him for his insightful analyses of over 1,700 works by Jewish and non-Jewish authors on historical as well as contemporary Polish-Jewish interrelations. Jan's analyses of the Holocaust literature in particular reveal significant falsifications, misrepresentations, and material omissions about Poland and the Poles, and this, of course, largely explains why Polish-Jewish relations remain problematic. So, Jan, welcome, and we thank you for being our speaker this evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad to be on again. Tonight, I'm going to be speaking about communism in Poland and why it's important, because communism actually killed 100 million people worldwide, yet communism is almost entirely ignored in favor of Nazism, relative to the Jews, that is. And I want to do something to correct it, however little.
Well, let me just offer for our audience, Jan, if I may, just 3 points. The first is that we'll start with your 2 websites, and these, I emphasize, these are an excellent resource for the serious student, and I can put the 2 URLs for our attendees in the chat. On Jan's first website, called Justice for Polish Victims, Jan will discuss Poles under communism, and on his second website, called Jews and Poles Database, Jan will discuss how the online search results for the Holocaust vastly outnumber search results for the word gulag. We'll then review the 2 slides. On the first slide, Jan will discuss the various ways in which the Holocaust narrative deceitfully diminishes the extensive and barbaric crimes of communism. And then on the second slide, Jan will briefly review the short timeline in which Stalin brutally imposed communism on Poland. And then lastly, we'll engage Jan with questions on Stalin's communization of Poland and the cursed soldiers' resistance. So, Jan, I'll do a share screen on your first website, and you can take it from there. If you'll give me just a minute, we'll go ahead and do
Absolutely.
that. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I've got to get on the right website. Here we go. And okay, this is just technical details sometimes are a bit. So here we go. Okay. So,
okay, this is my second website. Now, if you want to learn about communism, I'm giving homework first. I'm giving you some things to read first. Under recommended books, go under Poles under communism. Click on that, Gene.
There we go.
Okay, here I'm going to show you. There's many books here. I'm just showing you just 3. First one is about the gulags, a rare objective Jewish view of the gulags with some problems, a book I reviewed. Then there's a second one, the genocide of Soviet Poles. In the Soviet Union, there was 2 million Poles. Several 100,000 of them were deliberately murdered by Stalin in a genocide, targeting them not because they resisted communism, but simply because they were Poles. And I talk about that. There's also a third one, shows the part about Soviet archives. It was roughly 1 to 1.5 million Poles deported to Siberia. This included my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt were among them in 1940. And then eventually they were released. They went to England, Africa, and then the United States, where I was born in 1954. Now, Russian archives have been found. They only admit about 370,000 Poles. And too many historians have uncritically believed them as being valid, but they're not. There's actually evidence that the Soviets actually falsified, not just for propaganda purposes, even their archives for various reasons. So it's a shame that too many historians are blindly believing these archival sources as gospel truth when they're not. I get into that. Okay, that finishes this section. Yes.
So then we'll get into the, you wanted the second website then, Jan? And we'll get that one up. Give me 2 seconds and we'll get you up on that. And Here we go. Let's see, where are we? Okay, let's see. Okay.
Apple bomb.
Apple bomb it is. Here we go.
Okay, I wanted to take a closer look at one of these. All right, type in the word apple bomb into the search site.
Here, apple bomb.
Apple bomb. Yes. Okay, and click on the second one.
I got the second one, Gulag and stuck up. Here we go.
Okay, this is a book I've reviewed about the gulags, the Soviet concentration camps. It's by a Jewish author. It's relatively good, but it does have the usual Judeo-centric biases. But I expanded my review. I actually considered how often, how much of the public imagination is captured by the Jews and their Holocaust compared with the communist crimes. So I went on Google. You can highlight that. Holocaust on Google has 170 million mentions. Gulag has only 10.7 million mentions. So there's, in other words, Holocaust is mentioned 16 times more often than Gulag. And there's more. Now, please highlight the second line. Okay. Holocaust Remembrance Day, 835,000 mentions. Black Ribbon Day, whoever heard of that? That's August, every August 23rd, remembers the crimes of communism. 37,000 mentions. 22 times, the Holocaust Remembrance Day is mentioned 22 times more often than the Black Ribbon Day. And then please highlight the next paragraph. Okay, now look at Washington, D.C. There's at least two museums of note there. Both museums enjoy publicity, prestige, because they are in the U.S. Capitol, and both have access to tourist visitors. But look, what world of difference. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has over 1 million mentions, whilst abbreviation USHMM enjoys 1,380,000 mentions. There's also a Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C. Whoever heard of it? Until a few months ago, I never heard of it. Even though I read this stuff a lot, I never heard of it either. That's how little known it is. It's buried. 4,740 mentions. They're trivial. So the Jews Holocaust through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is 217-fold and a 290-fold, one-fold Jewish advantage. Well, some people say, well, it's because it hasn't been publicized a lot, the communist crime. Well, how can they be publicized when we don't have access to the media? We have no way of shaping public opinion, shaping academia, and things like that, whereas the Holocaust has huge advantages in these whole areas. It's not even close. All right, now let's see what activism would do. If we got more publicity, would this make much difference? To test this, highlight the next paragraph, please. Okay. All right. All right, yeah, okay. It was, the Armenians have done a heck of a job promoting knowledge of their genocide. Much better job than Poles have done, sorry to say. And what do they have to show for that? Not by that much. Armenian genocide gets mentioned 71 times less than the Jews Holocaust. So even with the activism, the Jews have a huge advantage. Very often Jews tell us that it's not a zero-sum game. You know, everybody can publicize their genocide, their suffering, whatever. That's bunk. You see, there is such a huge difference. It may as well be a zero-sum game. It may not be exactly a zero-sum game, but it's very, very close to it. And what's more, this is institutionalized to make the Holocaust more preferable than communist crimes. Okay, now please show the other website. And we are on this website. Look under IHRA, IHRA.
You want me to type that in, IHRA?
Yes. Exactly. Okay. All right, now click on the first one.
Yeah.
Okay. IHRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's one of the top worldwide organizations for promoting the Holocaust. They dictate to various nations, including Poland, how the Holocaust is to be taught, how it's not to be treated as if it was a part of World War II. It's supposed to be a separate event that stands and towers over anything else that happened to everybody else. They also have in this official publication and many others, they dictate to others how the Holocaust can be taught, and they call it Holocaust distortion if it doesn't comply with their way of thinking about the specialness of the Holocaust. And I get into that. But I wanted to show most of all, scroll down, please.
Yeah.
All right, scroll down. Okay, keep going down. Keep going. No, keep going. All right, stop. All right, stop. Okay. Now, highlight the paragraph that begins under Holocaust Peerless. Yeah. Okay. Now, you see, supremacist thinking. Here they say it openly. IHRA is a paradigmatic status of the Holocaust. Openly saying, what does that mean? That means other genocides are not paradigmatic. They're secondary. And then it's a symbolic status as the ultimate evil. What's this? This is racism. And implies that Jews are more important than anybody else. That the death of a Jew is more important than the death of a Goy. And that no other genocide is ultimate evil. Only the Jews' Holocaust is open evil. Okay. And down now, let's get into communism itself. Okay. Please scroll down. Okay, highlight the big no-no, equating communist crimes. They specifically, okay, good. They specifically condemn, warn against, and condemn any comparison of communist crimes with the Holocaust. They put it kind of in a kind of weaseling manner. History museums may even engage unwittingly in acts of distortion. They call it distortion when it doesn't fit their ideas about the supremacy of it. As purveyors of a national, for example, some institutions may draw an equivalence between Nazi crimes and those of the Stalinist regime in ways that de-emphasize the Holocaust. Well, what the heck am I reading? This is blatant racism. They're blatantly saying that Nazi crimes and those of the Stalinist regime cannot be equated. And they're openly saying, they're not hiding it, they're openly saying that the Holocaust must not be de-emphasized. In other words, Holocaust must always be above those of even if communist crimes are mentioned and reluctantly tolerated, they always must be secondary to the Jews and their Holocaust. Okay, let's take a closer look in ways that communist crimes are minimized. Okay, please show the blue slide.
Give me a second. We'll get there.
Absolutely, yes.
Second. Okay, got to stop shooting. And then we're going to show this one. Good.
Okay, very good. All right, here I talk about how communism is depreciated. I've done some study. I've summarized what it. Let's start at the very left. Nowadays, we hear a lot about McCarthyism. How many people died because of McCarthyism? Nobody. McCarthyism, some people were in the 50s were accused of being communists that were not. And today's academic narrative makes a big deal how horrible it was that anybody was accused of being a communist, while the communists were murdering millions of people. See? Total nonsense. This deliberate distortion effect. They're more worried about somebody's feelings being hurt and even some careers being ruined, more concerned about that than they are about millions of people being killed because of communism. And it gets even worse. What do we have today? I noticed a while ago, the communism all my life used to be spelled with a capital C, but almost all publications today suddenly switched, and now they spell it with a small c. Now compare that with the Holocaust. The Holocaust, of course, is spelled with a capital H. It wasn't always so. I've read some works in the early 50s where Jews already used the word Holocaust with reference to themselves, 6 million of them killed by the Germans, but they used Holocaust with a small h. So you see the role reversal. Orwellian manipulation of language. Holocaust was something relatively unimportant that became supremely important as a capital H, whereas communism used to be important, and now it's been kind of pushed aside and minimalized by using it with a small c. Okay, now let's go to the top left. Okay, this is related, directly related to the Holocaust, how it minimizes. It's not minimizes communism, not only with the lack of publicity of communism, which I showed earlier, and not only with Holocaust being above, but there's specific ways of thinking about it that are used. For example, proponents of the Holocaust keep saying that the Germans, Nazis, were out to murder all the Jews, whereas under communism, no ethnic group was targeted for extermination. Now, this is wrong and disingenuous for a couple of levels. First of all, it implies a meritocracy of suffering. So the Jews are saying because they were targeted for total annihilation, none of the victims of communism were, therefore Jews deserve more attention and recognition. That is a victim hierarchy where they are at the top and they decide what the rules are. Well, if we're going to have victim competition, yes, the Jews are leading it. If we're going to have this kind of meritocracy of suffering, victim hierarchy, we could do something else. We could say that 35 million Chinese murdered by Mao Zedong is far more than this just 6 million Jews. So therefore, the Chinese win the victim trophy. They're the ones, the Chinese and not the Jews, are entitled to all the attention and recognition. Then we could say another thing. The Ukrainians of the Holodomor, the famine, genocide. See, look at that. Jews died, usually they died quickly from bullets or gas at the hands of the Germans, whereas the poor Ukrainians, they starved to death over weeks and months. So we can argue a meritocracy of suffering, a victim hierarchy. Ukrainians suffered more than the Jews, and therefore Ukrainians are entitled to more attention and recognition than the Jews. But of course, this is nonsense. There is no valid meritocracy of suffering. So the fact that allegedly Jews were scheduled for total extermination does not mean anything. It's not special, not distinctive, does not give them any kind of special advantages or privileges over any other people. Even though they claim it all the time and they get it, they have absolutely no right to anything like that. Then there's some other auxiliary arguments. First of all, that communism is not, look at the top left, the communism is not exterminatory. Well, that's not true. Communist class, we're not there yet. Communism exterminated by classes, not by races or ethnicities. The communists tried to exterminate the bourgeoisie, the property-owning classes. It didn't matter if you were a bad property owner or a good property. It doesn't matter whether you personally exploited working class people. No, if you're bourgeoisie, you are condemned just for being bourgeoisie or targeted. So yes, communism was exterminatory in that way. The argument, well, communists didn't exterminate all bourgeoisie because they couldn't. There were too many of them. You could not go, you have to rehabilitate some of them because there are too many of them. You can't do it. Like when the Jews say, well, the Holodomor, there's no evidence that Stalin ever tried to exterminate all the Ukrainians. Disingenuous. Of course, he couldn't. There was 45 million Ukrainians. So Stalin could not exterminate 45 million Ukrainians, even if he hoped for it, because it was simply impractical. It torn the whole Soviet Union completely apart, if not wiped it out. Then another auxiliary argument has to do with rehabilitation. Communism does rehabilitation. Communists talk about re-educating class enemies, things like that. Whereas the idea being what a Jew under Nazism had no chance of being rehabilitated or re-educated to be become an acceptable member of German society. A Jew was simply unilaterally condemned. Well, both counts, this Holocaust supremacist argument is wrong because, in a sense, Hitler did rehabilitate some Jews, those who were his friends, like Dr. Bloch, the doctor. Then there Goebbels, a radio person named Bonner. He turned out to be Jewish. Instead of Goebbels having a fit and sending Bonner straight to the gas chambers, no, he allowed Bonner to make a legal fiction that he didn't notice. He didn't know his father was really Jewish or not, and so he could pass for a half Jew, and then Goebbels could look the other way and tolerate a half Jew, and Bonner could stay at his spot. At times, Hitler released some Jews for money. In some cases, mostly half Jews imported, but also full-blooded Jews were reclassified by the Nazis as honorary Aryans, and they were spared. So it's manifestly not true that a Jew could, under no circumstances, be rehabilitated under Nazism, because there's much more to it than that. I've written about it. I'm just summarizing it. Also, the communist claim of rehabilitation of class enemies, re-education, was propaganda. They were saying they're re-educating class enemies through forced labor in the gulags. That's not re-education, it's huge exploitation. And moreover, when the sentences were over, a lot of the victims were not released. They were forced to stay. They were not some rehabilitation. It's not rehabilitation. It's punitive. It's not rehabilitation. And not only that, but also a lot of the descendants, the adult children of the kulaks, the peasants, landowning peasants, were condemned. They were also condemned simply because their parents were class enemies. So these new members, these adult children of gulags, they were discriminated against. They could not get jobs. Lots of other things I've documented in my writings. So communism does rehabilitation. That's a farce. It's mostly false. It's not true. Okay. Now let's look up Historikerstreit. The academics are very strongly Judeo-centric and Holocaust supremacist, and they enforced it. There were a number of German scholars in the 80s who suggested that Nazism was actually a copy of communism, and it was. I've documented some, including Goebbels, who said, "We have studied the methods of the communists in minute detail, and you know what? We're not only going to match it, we're going to exceed it." And so German scholars spoke up, and right away there was a torrent of cancel culture, canceling them, silencing them, saying you can't compare Nazism with communism. You cannot say that Nazism was a copy, competitive imitation of communism, or anything like that. So the Historikerstreit is called, as historians debate this, was to silence opposition to any kind of comparison of Nazism and especially to maintain Holocaust supremacy as above all other crimes. Now, a little bit further right, there's something called double genocide. No, we're not there yet. Double genocide. All right, double genocide. That's the idea that one genocide was of the Jews by the Nazis, the other was by Slavs by communism. Jews are absolutely furious that any such comparison could be made, and that's why they call it double genocide. You can look it up at Wikipedia, how much resistance this idea gets. Now, going to the right, there's various ways that Jews try to ridicule and delegitimize Poles who do speak up about their victimhood, like under communism. They say, "Oh, Poland is the Jesus Christ of nations," to talk about suffering, which is funny because the Jews talk about their suffering 100 times more than Poles ever do. And also Jews and others complain about Poland's heroic narrative, that Poles like to talk about their heroism and stuff like that. It's like the Jews have no heroes, so they like to run down other people's heroes. So they kind of ridicule Polish achievements and Polish stuff, all for the purpose of keeping the Holocaust in first place, and to prevent Poles from getting recognition for their suffering. Now, there was other things going also with depreciation. Let's look at the bottom right, okay? Some Polish leftists, some Jews and Polish leftists try to create a false equivalence. They say the Polish guerrillas, żołnierze wyklęci, were just like the communist guerrillas. They were bandits, they were murderers, they were cutthroats. That's absolutely false. In the case of communists, they knew they had no support in the population, so communist guerrillas would regularly rob from Poles and kill them in order to get provision. Those guerrillas that were loyal to Poland, first the Armia Krajowa under the Germans, and then the NSZ under the Germans, and then the żołnierze wyklęci, such as WIN, W-I-N, another organization, they typically bought provisions from the peasants. If they could forcibly requisition, say, a cow for a meal, but they would always pay the owner for it. They were forbidden under power of court-martial from robbing. So it's a false equivalent to say, well, all guerrillas were bandits. They're all absolutely the same thing. Others try to depreciate this by saying that, well, a lot of Poles were communists. Well, yes and no. When communism took over and became inevitable, then yes, a lot of Poles resigned to it and became communists. Before that, there was minimal support for communism. That's why the Soviet Union used force to impose its way on Poland. They knew they would never make it on their own. Now, there's also the matter of neglected equivalences. That's the subject of a Jewish communism and the criminality and imposing communism. Yitzhak Arad is one example. He's a Holocaust scholar. I know, I've read some of his reviews. Yitzhak Arad was accused of being a communist guerrilla during war who killed Lithuanians. Now, the Jews have been going around blaming Lithuanians for collaborating with the Nazis and killing thousands of Jews, and also celebrating anti-communist heroes who used to be Nazi collaborators earlier and killed Jews. And so the Lithuanians returned the favors and stuck it back to the Jews by accusing Yitzhak Arad of being a criminal. And that was very quickly hushed and buried. But it does give me an idea that there has to be equal justice for both sides. You cannot suppress the crimes of Jewish communists. You cannot expect Lithuanians and Poles and others to, quote unquote, come to terms with the past about Nazi collaboration, while the Jews are perpetually exempt from coming to terms with the past, with their criminality, like in communism and anything like that. Okay, now you may go on. Okay, these are some of the steps that were used to force communism on Poland. It was, you see, it was a gradual process, but it all began from the beginning, long before. A lot of times, communism is excused by the fact that the Red Army was in Poland, and really the Allies, just nothing that the Allies could do. That's false. Poland was sold out long before, years before the Red Army ever set foot in Poland. Already in the Tehran Conference, the Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin moved Poland's borders westwards, okay? All right, this was a unilateral concession. It clearly communicated to Stalin that Stalin can get pretty much anything that he wants, that the Allies, Western Allies, Churchill and Roosevelt, do not give a rip about Poland. Very little use Poland as a sacrificial lamb. And of course, Stalin became bolder and bolder. He thought he could get away with it, that the Western Allies will give him what he wants. And surprise, he went for more. Okay, as soon, there was really no time of freedom of Poland. As soon as while the Red Armies were driving the Nazis, Germans out of Poland, they quickly began arresting Polish freedom fighters. First, they disarmed the Polish guerrillas that were not part of the communists and forced them either to join the Red Army, or in some cases, their officers were murdered on the spot or sent to Siberia. So there never was a semblance of freedom in Poland to begin with. The Soviet Union was not a liberator at any time. Even from the beginning, the Soviet Union was simply a second conqueror that was driving the first conqueror, Germany, out of Poland. Okay, and so then there was a provisional government which the Soviets set up, a series of stooges that would serve them, that would allegedly represent the workers. They were communists. There never was any freedom for anything like that. There was the UB, Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, or Bezpieka, the communist secret police, mostly of Poles, that was modeled right directly after the Soviet NKVD, Narodny Komisariat Vnoutrzennych Dział, the dreaded Soviet secret police. Poland was a police state from the very beginning, both with the NKVD and with the UB. At Yalta, by 1945, free and unfettered elections were declared. It was a total farce from beginning to end. You cannot have free elections when you have Soviet Union with totalitarian power over Poland to begin with, and you cannot have any kind of free elections that are not with international supervision. The Soviets, of course, refused any kind of international supervision of these elections, so the elections were a complete farce. Generally recognized the January 1947 elections were completely falsified. You know the old saying that came up in 2000, it's not who votes, it's who counts the votes. The communists counted the votes. Places were found where huge amounts of ballots were thrown out that did not fit the communists. So communists probably at most, even with all the terror and the intimidation, maybe got 20% of the votes, but they threw out most of the unfavorable ballots away. And so the falsified election showed communists getting 80% of the vote, which was a complete and absolute farce. Then, of course, after World War II ended, the Allies unrecognized a legitimate Polish government in London, the Polish government in exile. It was complete. And then, in June, please scroll down. In June 1946, wait, please scroll down.
Wait a second.
Okay, you got it. All right. So 3 times yes referendum. Even then, the peasants were had to vote on such things as nationalization of property, communism in steps. And the peasants were warned that they would lose their land, or their children would not be able to go to school if they voted no. So clearly there was in strong arm tactics to force that. And then there was the sham parliamentary elections, not free and unfair, officially brought the communists to power. Polish guerrillas, the Żołnierze Wyklęci, fought against the communists. Commonly, they attacked government outposts or prisons to free the Poles. But of course, there was no chance of success because there was overwhelming Soviet power, and there was no airdrops of ammunition to the guerrillas. That was the same thing during World War II. The RAF dropped tons and tons of arms and ammunition to guerrillas in occupied France, in Yugoslavia, very few to Poland. The pretext given was that Poland was geographically too far from British bases, which is absolute bunk, because the RAF bombed places like Königsberg, which was even further from British bases than most of Poland. So certainly they could have dropped tons of arms and ammunition to Polish guerrillas. Didn't want to because they didn't want to offend Stalin. So without airdrops, you have a very small amount supply of arms and ammunition. That's why the Warsaw Uprising, only about a quarter of the guerrillas were armed. You consider, if you have one pistol or one grenade, you consider yourself armed. It's a joke, you know, not a chance, because they had no real supply, except some homemade weapons, some captured weapons. That's just much less than they need. So it could never be, guerrilla warfare could never be that significant. That's why the Warsaw Uprising failed, plus the betrayal of the Soviets. And so that's how it was. And then after the sham elections, most of the guerrillas gave up because there was no chance of a free Poland. They sensed that the West had betrayed Poland, and given the Soviet Union what it wants, there's no point in just meaningless shedding of blood. So that's how it happens. Tens of thousands of Poles were arrested right away from the beginning. In the early 1950s, there was as many as 200,000 Polish Poles put in prison by the communist authorities. It was total, not so much the murders, it was total repression. Okay.
Yeah, let's go to the questions now, and see how
Alright.
those work. And let me get over there. I've got to actually drop a couple of these websites here. They're kind of in the way here, but give me 2 seconds and we'll get on to the questions. Let's see here. Yeah, that's good. So you know what the foundation for all of this, Jan, was your bulletin, Silly Holocaust Serving Suppression of Communist Crimes, and you went through that in great
Right.
detail. Now you did point out that Soviet citizens were looking at 20 to 25 million that were murdered, and as you mentioned earlier, 85 to 100 million. I think if you want to include the Chinese.
Worldwide by communism, yes.
Yes, right. So looking at, as you were pointing out, looking at the communists of Poland in post-World War II years, and this is what we're going to be looking at here shortly, we do see the coordinated efforts of as you pointed out, the NKVD, Soviet Secret Police, and of course the Polish Secret Police, the UB. And we're talking about arrests, murders, imprisonments, even concentration camp incarcerations, and of course
Right.
there were the deportations that you had mentioned. Now, here's where we get, I think, into some of the knowledge that I think Americans are really unaware of. And this, of course, is Stalin's policy was to place communists of Jewish background in the top positions in the Ministry of Public Security, in the judiciary, and then also, I think, as you point out, investigative agents. And they hunted down, they tortured, they prosecuted, and even executed Polish freedom fighters. So they were pretty malicious. I think they had malicious counterparts in the judiciary as well. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you to address is that many of these changed their Jewish names to Polish names, and I've got some examples of these that come to mind. Józef Światło, formerly Isaac Fleischfarb, Itzhak Fleischfarb, excuse me. Józef Różański, formerly Joseph Goldberg. We have Jerzy Bojeja, formerly Benjamin Goldberg. Helena Wolinska in the judiciary, we're talking about Fajga Mendla Danielak. We have Roman Wromkowski, Menashe Grunspan earlier, of course, and Maria Gurowska, Maria Zand, Julius Hibner, formerly David Schwartz, and Józef Chaplitsky, formerly Isidor Kurz. So there were these, and there were others. So what are the reasons why these and other prominent communist operatives? Why did they change the Jewish names to Polish names? What purpose did that serve?
Well, the idea was the communist authorities that encouraged, but then forced Jewish communists to change their names to appear to be Poles, because they to add to the create a false legitimacy for the government, to make the new communist government appear to be Polish, even though it was largely Jewish and foreign to. So that's why they wanted these Jews wanted to become crypto Jews and to hide their Jewishness. In a sense, this backfired. Instead of making the communist government look Polish, it made the Poles ever suspicious. Who is actually a Pole? It went to extremes. At times, even Lech Walesa was accused of being actually a Jew. With Leib Coney. I think that's ridiculous, but that makes the point. There's just crypto Jews hiding their background, encourage Poles to be suspicious who's actually a Pole and who's actually a Pole ruling over Poland, and that even if he's a communist, Pole ruling over, and who is a Jew or somebody else ruling over Poland, who is a real Pole and who is pretending to be a Pole. That's the idea.
Considering the crimes, of course, as we mentioned, across Poland, I mean, everything concerning murder, torture, imprisonment, concentration camps, so on and so forth. You also point out in your bulletin that the communists of Poland, many of which I just named, they effectively escaped justice because of the thick line statement. I guess in Polish it's called the gruba kreska.
Right.
And this was what Tadeusz Mazowiecki introduced. He was, of course, actively involved in the Solidarity movement way back in 1980. Became Poland's prime minister August 89 through the partially free elections right after that. But the question, of course, is, can you briefly describe this thick line statement? What was the purpose of it? Do we have an idea as to what his thinking was? And again, I'll ask you in just a minute to contrast that with the German actions, as far as there was no such thick line drawn. But what are your thoughts on Mazowiecki's thinking on the
Okay, I
thick
think
lines?
this whole thing is very controversial, that the round table agreements in 1989, where communism was replaced, was actually a farce. That actually was musical chairs where the communists stayed in power, but they morphed. They changed, they no longer had a Soviet serving orientation, but they still maintained their power in different ways. Now, suggestions were even made going as far as saying Mazowiecki and Lech Walesa were really secretly on the side of the communists all along. Now, I don't agree with that. That's a conspiracy theories. I do not do conspiracy theories. I only look at facts. However, the idea being that the communists actually kept up, for example, Adam Michnik Verschachter, that was his original Jewish name, he became head of Judge Gazeta Wyborcza, which is Poland's leading left-wing newspaper. He got that position. And now, they had a whole group of post-communists, they were called, and they still had power. Now, why this happened, I don't understand. I don't know why the Poles were so conciliatory to the communists, barring, of course, the conspiracy theories. My theory is that the Poles don't really have the willpower and the self-respect to cut themselves off fully from past. This continues to this day, for 30-some years after the 1989 Accords. You have the Palace called the Palace of Culture in Warsaw, which is a symbol of Stalin's rule over Poland, has not been torn down. And you have streets named after communist leaders that have not been renamed. Left-wing judges have ruled that they cannot be renamed. I don't know how it works. There's controversy about the judiciary in Poland, where communist judges get to appoint their successors, people who think like them. So in a sense, communism is still in Poland in the form of the judiciary, if nothing else, because Poles have not made a clean break with communism. This goes back to this idea that communism was not that bad, and so it doesn't need to be punished as much as the Germans forced to punish the Nazis. But of course, that was also because Germany was defeated militarily. She had to make a clean break with Nazism. A lot of the Nazi defendants were punished. A lot of them, many more Nazi defendants were not punished. The main thing, if they harmed Jews, then they were punished. If they harmed Poles, not as much. When you think of Heinz Reinhardt, he was one of the murderers of the Warsaw Uprising, murdered like 50,000 Poles. He didn't have to go to South America and hide somewhere in a jungle. No, he was a mayor of a town near Hamburg for decades. The Germans refused to bring him to justice or to extradite him to Poland. Some kind of deal was made where he escaped. Now, imagine a German that killed 50,000 Jews. Imagine him getting away with that. He wouldn't have gotten away with that for a week, let alone for decades of time. That's the double standard there.
Let's turn now to the cursed soldiers. Again, as you mentioned, Żołnierze Wyklęci, and we're looking at the situation in Poland right after World War II, and it's been described by many historians as effectively a civil war between, on the one hand, the various
we have to be careful.
groups.
Yeah, it's true, but you have to be careful with that. Civil war.
Yeah.
Civil war implied an equivalency of two sides. It was not. The Soviets imposed it on Poland right away as they entered, as I mentioned. And then the Poles who fought for communism did so weak. Even Stalin admitted that if it wasn't for the Red Army, communist rule in Poland would not last for a week. So it's not like you have two sides that are more or less equally balanced, worthy of a civil war. The communists were really, without Soviet support, the communists were so weak and insignificant, they could have gotten nowhere. They would have been gone in a week.
Okay, so looking at the UB, which, as you said, was obviously supported by the Soviet president, just looking at the UB and in general, it was clearly one of the largest, most powerful of Poland's communist institutions. And I look at its responsibilities, and it's really quite staggering. You've got internal and foreign intelligence, you've got counterintelligence, you've got monitoring anti-state activity not only in Poland but also abroad. Obviously, wiretapping both government and civilian communications, influencing or supervising local governments, I guess is probably a better way to put that. And as you know, they had the militia, they operated prisons and several concentration camps set up by the NKVD. So it was interesting you point out in your bulletin that these camps were, the Soviets basically reused many of the German concentration camps for the Poles. And so let's...
East Germany too, Buchenwald was reused by the communists. Under new,
yeah.
and a couple of others. I didn't look at that in detail. Basically under new management. Yeah. Totalitarian states are basically all alike under new management. But of course, Nazis get all the condemnation, well, for killing Jews, that is, whereas communists get very little condemnation for their totalitarian acts. Yeah, back to that.
Yeah. I like the way you put that, change of management. And but
under new management, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So cynical, laughable.
Well, let's look at now some of the Jewish communist officials. They were actually directly responsible for murdering patriotic Poles, and the names that come to mind are obviously Helena Wolinska, Solomon Morel, and as you pointed out earlier, Michnik Welschechter. And so,
well,
but they were exempted from justice, right?
Yes,
Stefan. You can ask. Yeah, that's go ahead.
Brother of the brother of Adam Michnik Welschechter, yes. Now, the idea was they left in 1968, so it was a win-win for the Jews. They could blame Poles for anti-Semitism for when a Gentile communist kicked the Jewish communists out, and at the same time they could make themselves victims of communism worldwide, and at the same time they could escape justice. It was a win-win-win situation for the Jewish communists. Like Stefan Michnik went to Sweden. He make excuses for his crimes. What I did was my business. How funny. Any criminal saying my crimes are my business. Yeah, I'm nice. How cynical. Or he said, well, I was young, Do you imagine letting the Nazis go? Could I go, well, the human brain is not fully developed until you're 24, so your sense of judgment is not fully developed. Somebody younger than 24, they could say they're young. They really didn't know what they were, fully understand what they were doing, and make that excuse. Imagine making such an excuse for the Nazis, for killing Jews, that is. Would that ever work? Of course not for killing Jews. But here, Stefan actually said that. He had Wolinska escaping to England, and it used to be extra excuse because Poland was anti-Semitic. That was the excuse for not letting her go. So we could Nazis could make the same excuse. Well, it's Victor's justice, and all. Well, they did try that excuse. It's Victor's justice, And so, but they never got away with it. But of course, she did. And so again, this goes back to this double standard. We never punish Jewish criminals for killing the Goyim, but we punish the Goyim for killing Jews, the Nazis for killing Jews. We searched the world over. 100-year-old Nazis are still being found and prosecuted. A few of them are still left alive. But of course, no such justice to communist criminality.
Looking at the cursed soldiers once again, we know that they were the primary target of the UB. And I think as we were indicating, they were kind of comprised of an array of various resistance groups. They were, of course, obviously anti-Soviet, anti-communist, and so on. And as you pointed out, they were formed by the Polish underground state in the later stages of the war, and then obviously directly afterwards. I wanted to just consider some of the guerrilla warfare tactics and successes. We know that they waged guerrilla warfare even as late as, I think it was 1963.
Yeah, there was a few kept fighting for years. Most of them died out in 1948. When the communist government came to power, the idea the West had betrayed Poland. There's no point keep on fighting, hoping for free Poland. It's a foregone conclusion. Why spill blood for something that has no chance of it? So, but quite a few kept fighting till the 50s. The latest one, 1963, October 19. I was 9 years old. Amazing. 18
Yeah.
years into the Red Army and entered Poland. 19 years. He was still fighting it.
To one of your other analyses on your website, you review the book. It's called Indomitable Soldiers' Biographies. It's in Polish.
Right.
The author is Mateusz Saweczko, and as you point out, he examines something like 75 anti-communist guerrilla leaders and their patriotic deeds. And I just wanted to just share a couple of these. Obviously, you pointed out there were some successful attacks against the Germans during the war, but they also conducted successful attacks on communist forces after the war. And so I just wanted to just offer a couple. There was you point out there was a 200-man unit led by Marian Baranciak. This was in July of 45 after the war was over. They took a communist prison in Puławy. They freed 107 imprisoned freedom fighters. There was a battle in the Stotsk forest, defeated larger communist units, killing 60 NKVD and then 10 MO, the Milicja Obywatelska, and UB folks at a loss of 11 men. So they were definitely at that point in time, I think, certainly to be reckoned with. There was another unit that you mentioned is Józef Kurash. I think his name was his nom de guerre was Ogien, and this was from 45 to 47. They killed over 60 UB functionaries, and then also 40 communist militiamen, and even, as you point out, 27 NKVD functionaries. And there's one other one I think that's worth mentioning, Franciszek Olszówka. His nom de guerre was Otto. They assassinated Soviet soldiers that were robbing Poles, and again, late in 45 and 46, they shot several UB men and attacked several MO outposts. So you point out also, this is an interesting point, I think, that there was also a Jewish member of the Cursed Soldiers,
Yes.
Stanisław Oświęcimski,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, the communists, when they captured him, they tried to change him and said, look at all the Jews that are supporting communists. Why don't you step in line and be solidarity with them, become one of us? He refused, and he was also murdered. Yeah.
Well, in closing, I think the last question would be, we did point out, obviously, that the Soviets, the UB and the NKVDs, they were clearly focused on the suppression of Cursed soldiers, but we also know that they targeted Polish civilians, and I think this is a bit of a contrast. But I'm wondering if you can offer estimates of the number of civilians that were maybe arrested, and looking at the time frame from 44. Right before the war ended, all the way up to 55, I guess, right after the liberalization,
Okay.
after Stalin died.
The number of
what do you think?
The number of Poles that that died on both sides, the actual conflict, UB had claimed several thousand Polish lives. The Poles who were put on trial and put to death form about 10,000 to 20,000, but that does not include tens of thousands of others were simply murdered without the formality of a trial. So the number of Poles who actually died because of communism on both sides could be on the order of 40,000. However, that's dwarfed by the Poles that were sent to prison, even after the guerrilla warfare pretty much died out after 1948, like 200,000. It was absolute repression, iron-handed repression of Polish society in every way. It's deliberately a second occupation. Soviets serving, full Soviet presence did not end until about 1955. So about 10 years afterwards, there was a substantial Soviet presence behind these Polish stooges of the Soviets.
Very, very interesting, very compelling. I think the point you made about Poles not being quite as perhaps resistant against communism as we perhaps would want to believe, and so on.
Well, over decades, over time, when communism became more and more domestic, it became more and more natural. That could be part of the process that Poles didn't want to put communists on trial, that Gruba Kreska not punish communist crimes, because that would divide Polish society. It would reopen old wounds. The same reason why a lot of African Americans don't want the police to press too hard against the gang members, because the gang members may be their uncles, they may be their brothers, they may be their friends. And so there's some kind of a little bit of an identification with this kind of criminal element. But mainly, I think it's basically Polish cowardice and lack of spirit, and Poles not punishing the communists, not making a clean break with the communists, and more generally, in my opinion, not standing up for their own interests.
That's very well put. And well, I think for our attendees and also for Jan and myself, I mean, we're coming now to a close on the webinar, and we'd like to thank you, Jan, for being our speaker this evening, and for our attendees, thank you for your interest and your attendance. And so I think we'll go ahead and consider a follow-on webinar with a different topic. And I think at this point, Jan, we can pretty much bid our friends dobranoc and a good night, if that's
Okay, I think so, sure. Polska siła, Polish power.
good night, everyone.
Good night.